Good morning. This is Defcon Leader from Defcon 1 Georgia Airsoft Team. This morning I'm going to do a install of a Redline N7 Milsim HPA unit, drop-in unit, into a Krytac gearbox. I was asked by Sam, my sponsor from Airsoftjunkiez, if I would do a video showing how I installed the N7 unit into a Krytac gearbox. I've done it successfully on an LVOA. Now I'm doing it on one of my team members' Krytac SPR PDW combo that he had recently purchased, and he had decided that he wanted to go with a N7 Milsim unit. And basically, in order to install that unit into a Krytac gearbox, you actually have to do some milling to the inside of the actual gearbox. Krytac's gearboxes are really, really well made and really well put together. But you actually have to mill some areas out, being that this has ambidextrous safety and fire selector. They have a shaft that comes through, and it actually is in the way of the actual trigger unit that is made by Redline for the Milsim unit, and you actually have to machine down part of the actual trigger piece from Redline. Here's the actual unit here. We'll open this up and I'll show you the unit. Here's the unit here, and then basically what they do with this is, on most gearboxes, you have the pin that goes through the gearbox and the body that actually holds it in, and it goes through here, and then they have a pin on the back side here that normally goes in the gearbox, and that area where that pin normally sits is where this hole is for the selector fire and safety, switch. So basically, because this is the area where the pin goes, and this is the area where this little pin here on the actual safety unit would basically, on the gearbox, and I'll show you on the other half of the gearbox. Here's the other half of the gearbox here. This little pin on the actual trigger unit would go actually where this selector switch lever actually goes through the gearbox for the ambidextrous safety. And then you have this meat that's in here of the gearbox, and you have this piece here, which is where the wires from the AEG would normally run down into the gearbox and go to the motor and come across and come back up and go out the buffer tube where the battery would be. You have to actually remove this piece here, and you have to actually do some machining right here to get the trigger unit from Redline to actually go into the gearbox. And the way that it would sit in here would be like so. So as you can see, because that is supposed to go in here, and the hole for the pin that goes through the body would go through here, you have to remove this area of the gearbox and machine that stuff out to actually get this in. Then what you have to actually do is you have to actually machine off the back part of this trigger housing that holds the air depressor for the trigger. You have to actually machine the back of this off as well, so that you can retain the ambidextrous safety lever. So in this video, I'm going to actually probably break this video up into two parts. This would be part one. Part two will be after I actually mark all of these areas that have to be machined out, and then I'll start the video as I start machining all of these pieces out of the way. You're going to retain the use of the stock trigger from Krytac, which is actually a really nice blade trigger. I'm able to set the trigger depressor, which is here, I'm actually able to set this up to where I set that real nice and tight so there's no actual slop in the trigger at all whatsoever. You retain and use the stock trigger spring, which is right here. It's the pin that I was talking about that goes through the actual gearbox. And if you notice, I milled the flat spot here that runs this whole length here across, and I milled that all off. Then if you notice down here, it also has a flat spot here. That flat spot is where the N7 trigger depressor mount will actually sit and lock up against this ridge right here, so that when you're pressing the trigger, the front pin is actually holding it in, but this actually keeps it from wanting to push up inside the gearbox and move. This next part of the gearbox is where I had mentioned that we had to mill out that piece that was in here for the wire area to go through. And as you can see, I milled that whole piece out, milled out around where the selector lever goes through the gearbox for the ambi safety and fire selector. As you can see, I left this little area here. And now here's the trigger, the plunger, depressor. You know, the trigger presses against this. This is just an air valve, so when it presses against it, it actually causes it to fire. But as you can see, I milled off this area here. Took that all out of there. And then here, you have to mill a flat spot here, down here, so that when this is actually inside the gearbox, which we'll go ahead and put it in the 1/2 of the gearbox here. When this is in the 1/2 of the gearbox, now you have the clearance right here for the lever to go through, but you also mill this little area up on the top of that so that when you put the gear back here that goes on here for the selector switch, the gear has clearance, because the way the gear actually is recessed in here a little bit, so that gives you the clearance down in there. So there's the trigger inside the frame. Now I can take the 2/2 of the gearbox. Well, let's go ahead and put the actual trigger in. And this will show you what it'll do. So what we'll do now is we'll take this 1/2 of the gearbox here, where the trigger is going to go. We will take the safety lever and rotate it so that it moves it up here. And we take the pin, put the pin up through here, take the trigger, put the trigger in its slot with the spring. It's a little bit complicated. Well, we don't really need the spring, but so now there's the trigger itself. And this comes down in here, and that's the setup now. So now you can see how that is all in there, and you can see that that's right where it needs to be. There's no slop in there. It literally is right where it has to be on that, the plunger. And then when you take the other 1/2 of the gearbox and put the other 1/2 of the gearbox here, this whole thing now will line up, and it all goes together nice and tight. And as you can see, everything is lined up, and you can see that the area that we were talking about, you can see where this comes through, and I got just enough space in there for that to rotate without a problem. I'll actually see if I can get it to rotate for you. It's kind of a hard thing to turn. but we'll try to get it to turn. But you can see in there that there's plenty of room for that gear, and it now has the space that it needs so that you can get that to work. Now we take here and we turn this back to here, and that trigger is just right on the button. I mean, that's no spring in there, and you can see it's not all slopping, and it's a real nice crisp trigger pull. So that's the end of the second part of this. I hope that this video helps everybody be able to do a Krytac, but that's the milling and everything that has to be done, and I hope it all works out for anyone. And if anyone, you know, has trouble, I guess you could probably contact Airsoftjunkiez, and they could put you in contact with either myself or Aaron, the gun tech there. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy this video.